I feel like last time we spoke, or maybe shortly thereafter, you felt like you were on the naughty list in terms of press briefings. You had upset the powers that be and weren't getting called on anymore. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah. I've gotten called on exactly once by Miller since October 7th. I've inserted myself a few times. The assistant Pital has called on me, I don't know, maybe 5 times.
Okay.
So,
W-
so
And why do you think it is that? What was the question again that got you put on the no
well,
ask list?
I think it's a systematic thing. I ask fairly pointed, direct questions, and they don't like that. Um, you know, so yeah, I don't think it's any one particular thing, but I think I mean, most of the questions I've gotten in have been to show that the U.S. doesn't recognize the Geneva Conventions as applying to Palestinians,
Right.
which I think is kind of an important story.
Yeah.
Um,
Now I remember
but
that's what it was. All right. Well, it's my pleasure to have back on Bad Faith Podcast Sam Husseini. You know him as one of the most pointed, best question askers at the White House press briefings and I guess State Department press briefings that often go viral on Twitter and beyond. He's an independent journalist, and you can find him at Husseini.substack.com. Welcome back to Bad Faith.
Great to be with you. I don't know if I should voice my outrage about recent happenings with you, or if I should congratulate you on your newfound freedom.
Well, I like that framing. I went to the red line protest at the White House over the weekend, and a number of people came up to me, including Dr. Jill Stein, and said, congratulations on your liberation. And that put a big fat smile on my face. So thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm so glad to talk to you now that I have maybe a little bit of a battle scar, to talk to someone who's accumulated many more in the trenches of doing real journalism. I wanted to talk to you because I've seen you following very closely what does really seem to be the question of the moment, which is whose fault is it that a ceasefire has not been reached? And those who follow left media, those folks who've been following this podcast, know that we've expressed a great deal of skepticism about the narrative that's coming out of the White House, that the ceasefire has only not been achieved because of the reticence of Hamas. But we in particular decided to schedule this interview for later in the day with the hopes that you would be able to report back from today's press briefing. And it turns out it didn't happen. What's going on here? What do you think went down?
Well, they haven't had any press briefings this week. They used to not have any briefings when Blinken was, in the Middle East and so on. And then I objected to that because they would always brag, we have briefings every day. I said, no, you don't. So they started having them even when Blinken was out of town until this week. And now they've stopped having them. I think that they realize that there's a fair amount of scrutiny and that even mainstream people are starting to ask some legitimate questions. I think that even the critique of the administration doesn't get at how diabolical what the administration has done is in terms of this so-called ceasefire. Let's review what really happened here. On May 24th, the International Court of Justice issued orders that Israel must halt its offensive in Rafah. Now, the Biden administration has been saying that it was against Israel launching an offensive in Rafah. Israel started an offensive in Rafah, and they kept pretending that it hadn't actually happened yet, the Biden administration. In their ruling, the International Court of Justice agreed with South Africa that there was an offensive in Rafah. They said that it started on May 7th and that it must immediately stop. Now, that's the court. The court issues an order, and then it's up to the UN Security Council to implement the order. Algeria started writing a resolution to implement that order. The U.S. threatened to veto it. The Algerians seem to be, trying to placate the U.S. and watering it down and so on. Then on May 31st, Biden comes out and says, Israel has, put forward the ceasefire proposal, which was actually very similar to a ceasefire proposal that Hamas had agreed to at the beginning of May. and effectively then hijacked the UN security process, the UN Security Council process, insisting that the UN Security Council pass a resolution backing this so-called ceasefire proposal, claiming in the resolution that Israel had accepted it, even though Israel wouldn't say that it accepted it, certainly not Netanyahu, and demanding that Hamas do so, even though Hamas had basically accepted a very similar proposal. So what I think is really a major part of what's going on, and even most critics of the Biden administration are missing, is that this was actually a way of sabotaging the ICJ orders. This was a very hard one. I'm sorry?
How is that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, South Africa started its, and they invoked the Genocide Convention against Israel. And then they had a series of oral arguments and applications towards the ICJ. And, the International Court of Justice earlier in the year would issue orders like stop all genocidal activity. But they didn't demand that Israel halt all military activity. And so there was some level of ambiguity in those orders earlier in the year. But on the May 24th order, it was clear. They said, stop your offensive in Rafah. And what should have happened is that the Security Council should have implemented that or forced a U.S. veto. But that didn't happen because the U.S. came up with this cockamamie ceasefire thing that it claimed Israel agreed to, which Israel didn't agree to. So the net effect of this is, in effect, to have put a stop to what was a normal legal process, which was that the Security Council should have voted on a resolution based on the ICJ orders. Now, if you listen to the statements of all the countries when they voted for the U.S. draft resolution at the UN, a bunch of countries said, we want the ICJ orders implemented. But it wasn't in the resolution. So the U.S. has basically overridden a normal legal process and instead made everything revolve around this negotiation process that they effectively control. So it's an undermining of international.
In the interim, since there obviously is not a ceasefire deal that's been agreed to date, what precludes the ICJ from ratifying, validating, enforcing, I'm sorry, I don't remember the words you used, but enforcing the basically the ceasefire order from the end of May, or forcing a U.S. veto?
But the ICJ can't enforce anything. It can issue binding orders, legally binding orders. If you commit an illegal act, a judge can issue a ruling against you. But if the police force doesn't,
right. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get caught up in semantics, but what you just said, your argument that the kind of pending ceasefire negotiations have overridden the ceasefire instructions from the end of May. Since there is not, in fact, I can understand that argument if there were, in fact, a ceasefire that had been agreed to, but there still hasn't been. So is it just providing kind of political cover, a distraction for the extent to which there hasn't been any follow-up on the ceasefire agreement from the end of May?
Yeah, it's not a matter of an agreement. The court said this must happen. You, Israel, must stop your offensive in Rafah, period. It has nothing to do with Hamas is doing. It has nothing to do with anybody else is doing. It has nothing to do with what Israel says or doesn't say anything. The court made an order. The UN Security Council should have implemented that order. It didn't do that in large part because of these shenanigans by Biden and saying, oh, we got a ceasefire deal. Let's go with that instead of implementing a normal legal process.
So I guess what I'm getting at is what is actually precluding them from implementing it? Since, again, there is no, in fact, like I hear what you're saying in terms of maybe nobody has noticed that they hadn't implemented, or there's less pressure for them to implement it because of the discussion about the ceasefire process
let me
Yeah,
add a little bit to the story to sort of answer your
sure.
question. Um, what a normal process would have been, Algeria or somebody else drafts a resolution that says, we demand that Israel adhere to the order by the International Court of Justice of May 24th. That would have gone to a vote of this UN Security Council. A majority would have voted for it, and then the US would have raised his hands and vetoed it.
Hmm.
And the US would have gotten a severe black eye on the global stage. It has once again vetoed. This would have been the, the fourth or fifth veto regarding Gaza that the US has done since the beginning since October. But then what could have happened is that there's this additional process at the UN. If people might remember back last year when the US vetoed a prior ceasefire resolution, there have been several, and the US has
Right.
vetoed them. It went to the General Assembly under what's called Uniting for Peace. Uniting for Peace is this process whereby the General Assembly tries to take control of a situation when the Security Council has failed to implement peace and security, which is supposed to be its job. Um, and by 153 to 10, the General Assembly said, we want to cease fire now. Now, they didn't implement anything to do that, but they could. The General Assembly could do that. It just hasn't had the political will. So, in the face of US government obstructionism and vetoes and so on, what should have happened is Algeria should have put forward the resolution, US vetoed it, and then it goes to the General Assembly under Uniting for Peace, and then they start doing something with teeth in it. And that's what they did in the
Mm.
case of South Africa, for example. They start saying, we instruct member states to have economic sanctions against Israel. We instruct member states not to sell any weapons to Israel. We will suspend Israel at the General Assembly. We will bring Palestine on as a full voting member. There's a whole series of things that could and should have been done, and still could be done. Now it's later and later in the day, but they still could be done. It's a matter of the intestinal fortitude of other countries to step up to the plate. The only two countries that have really stepped up to the plate here are South Africa, which put forward the Genocide Convention case, and a bunch of countries now have joined that process, but it's still South Africa that's leading it, and Nicaragua, which put forward a similar case against Germany for aiding and abetting Israel's genocide. Those are the only two countries that really, put their order to the wheel here.
And,
So I mean,
and what do
part
you
of
make
what
though of
I
of I'm sorry, go ahead.
so, I mean, I think that people need to be getting other countries to be doing more. Brazil, Algeria, Turkey, Indonesia, Malaysia, all these countries that say a lot of good things, but haven't really stuck their necks out in terms of the legal processes that they can implement at the United Nations and elsewhere.
It's not a legal intervention, but what do you make of the choice of Colombia to suspend its coal exports to Israel?
That's good. That's a good step. But if you do it in a multilateral form, then you're pushing other countries to do similar things and more things, and you try to reach a critical mass. It dovetails with the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement because it lends increased international and legal legitimacy to that movement. Um, and it could also dovetail with attempts to effectively force international humanitarian aid in. They could back the prospect of flotillas going to Gaza to provide relief, since Israel has closed off the land crossings and destroyed some of the land crossings and so on. So there's a whole series of things that can and should be done through the General Assembly at this point.
So let's go back to the May 25th ceasefire discussion. American U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, comes out and says that this is non-binding. There was a whole colloquy, back and forth debate in the press rooms and the media at large about the extent to which that was false. And can you bring us from that point to the present, where just a couple of days ago, the UN Security Council passes this ceasefire proposal that's been drafted by the US, in which Biden seems to be trying very hard to sell as an Israeli proposal, despite repeated statements by Netanyahu and members of his government that it is not, in fact, his ceasefire deal, and reiterating, as he has been doing basically since the beginning of his conflict, that he does not want the sieging, the bombing, the war on Gaza to end until he has achieved the goal of eliminating Hamas.
Yeah, I think that there's a whole series of lies here. I don't think that the Israeli goal or Netanyahu's goal is the destruction of Hamas. I think that their goal is to do as much damage as possible to Palestinian society. Hamas is something of a pretext here. And you can tell that by their actions. For example, in January, when the ICJ issued its first order saying that there's a credible case of genocide here, what did Israel do? It immediately put out this story on UNRWA that caused countries to defund UNRWA. It's a calibrated strategy of dismantling the lifelines of support to Palestinian society. And similarly, now with the action that they just recently took, they used humanitarian cover to do their military action in the name of getting hostages, but actually killing a hell of a lot more Palestinians and killing some hostages, apparently. It caused the World Food Program to suspend in Gaza. So the net effect of their actual policies is a devastating, humane one. The U.S. has repeatedly claimed that UN Security Council, finally, prior to this, the one resolution that the U.S. abstained on and allowed to pass was the Ramadan truce, which passed with like 6 days left in Ramadan. It was kind of comical in a way. And then immediately they let it through, and then they immediately called that non-binding, even though it was a UN Security Council resolution. And the U.S., I don't recall the U.S. ever claiming that UN Security Council resolutions were non-binding. I'm not sure if I've answered every aspect of your question here. Please feel free to follow up. But the U.S. is attempting to pretend to be pushing Netanyahu while in fact facilitating him.
Well, I want to just, for the sake of clarity, you just alluded to the Nusret massacre of last weekend, which saw 174 at last count Palestinians.
200.
274 Palestinians killed, along with, I believe the current count is approximately 3 hostages killed, one of whom was an American citizen. 4 hostages rescued. This was hailed by the mainstream media as a cause for celebration, a successful hostage recovery mission. Of course, one that ended up in killing the same number of Israelis as it rescued, and one that ignores the extent to which there have been hostage exchange deals on the table, which could have achieved not just the same effect, but a much greater effect in terms of the number of hostages rescued without the the mass death and slaughter of so many Palestinians at the same time. That so-called rescue mission was also complicated and made more controversial by the fact that it appeared that the pier that had been built by the United States at the cost of over $300 million seemed to be the staging ground for launching aspects of the attack, and that, moreover, a humanitarian vehicle was used to Trojan horse the combatants into the refugee camp. People came to it thinking that this was supplies. This is obviously a population that is going through severe famine, need for medical supplies and the like, and has been for months and months, and then were shot at after having approached what they thought was a humanitarian vehicle, which is, of course, a violation of international law. I just wanted to lay that out a little bit because I don't think we've had an opportunity to talk about that attack, in particular on the program. I mean, do you think the kind of indefensibility of engaging in what seemed to be pretty clear violations of international law, the use of a humanitarian vehicle in that attack, the huge cost of civilian life for a relatively small number of hostages, and the fact that Israel has ignored and is continuing to ignore hostage deals that could result in the release of all of the hostages without the attendant loss of Palestinian life, is part of why you're seeing kind of a lack of responsiveness, frankly, from in terms of making themselves available to questioning from the press, in terms of a press briefing right now this week?
Oh, yeah. I think so. I think that there are so many problems and levels of problems with their storyline that I think it's become increasingly untenable, and they don't want to deal with it. I mean, at some levels, it's a brilliant strategy that they've employed. For example, slaughtering a bunch of Palestinians while getting 4 hostages makes it appear that their primary goal is to get hostages, when that's not their primary goal. If it was, as you inferred, they would have agreed to a deal much earlier. And Israel, of course, has the Hannibal directive, which even a UN report, which is just released, indicated that they applied on October 7th. That is, that Israel would rather kill people, including its own people, than allow them to be taken by Palestinian groups, because they don't want to be in a position of having to negotiate with Palestinian groups. That is, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and I don't want to skip past that either. So, obviously, a lot of people were reporting on this. Electronic Intifada has been all over this from the beginning, when it was very controversial, and people were getting a lot of flack for reporting on this Hannibal directive story. This UN Independent Commission of Inquiry, today, as we're recording this, just came out and found, quote, strong indications that the Hannibal directive was used in several instances on October 7th, harming Israelis at the same time as striking Palestinian militants. Meaning that, yes, as you just described, there was frankly, an instruction, a feeling that it is better for our own people to die and to be killed by Israeli forces than to be put in a position where you had to give anything up at all, including prisoner exchanges of Palestinian prisoners, in order to get them back. And the implications of that, when there has been so much stress over the kind of brutality, the inhumanity, the savagery, of course, I'm putting all of that in quotation marks, of Palestinians, and this weird kind of simultaneous, what does it mean to have this kind of preciousness relative to Palestinians about Israeli life, and then have the revelation that Israelis, frankly, don't seem to be valuing Palestinian life or Israeli life when it comes down to brass tacks behind the scenes?
Yes, the Israeli government views some level of Israeli Jewish life as perfectly expendable for their actual political goals, which is, again, to destroy Palestinian society or to do as much damage to it as possible under these set of circumstances. So that includes now, while pretending that they are out to save Israeli civilians, not ensuring their safety by entering into good faith negotiations. So now they've gone down this path of pretending that it's Hamas that's the main obstacle to negotiated settlement, when in fact it's Israel, and using this entire process to undermine normal legal processes. And I'd like to take a step back, if I could, Joy.
Please.
This is a standard tactic by Israel and the United States to not adhere to normal legal processes. For example, people might recall before the Oslo process was supposed to usher in a Palestinian state. Before the Oslo process, after the Gulf War, after the U.S. made its first attack on Iraq and was going to usher in a new world order and all of this stuff, and it used the UN to pummel Iraq, it agreed to a conference in Madrid that was supposed to apply international law to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It immediately undermined that by going on the back door and doing this Oslo process, which didn't have any basis in international law. that was just a behind the scenes negotiations, which was between an incredibly powerful Israel and an incredibly weak PLO, Yasser Arafat. And the U.S. forced this set of agreements, saying that within 5 years, we're going to have negotiations for final status terms, meaning a Palestinian state, dealing with refugees, dealing with the status of Jerusalem. That never happened. None of that ever happened. They imposed this very oppressive system on the Palestinians on the promise that something will come down the pike, but that never happened. And they got the international community and the Palestinians to sign on to this phony baloney process. So we're seeing that in microcosm here. We're seeing the US say, we have the ceasefire process that's going to solve everybody's problems, and everybody's got to sign on to it. And they put the onus on Hamas now, just like they used to put the onus on the PLO. Israel gets a free ride, but the US is in control of the process, and the US gets to say who's the good boy and who's the bad boy, rather than a legal process. I think this is part of a wider goal of the United States when it talks about a rules-based order, right? It wants a rules-based order where it gets to dictate the rules. It doesn't want a law-based order. It doesn't want legal processes. It wants to say, well, in this instance, we want this rule. And in this instance, we want this rule. And, we want to invade Afghanistan. So feminism is the pretext of the day. But when we talk about Saudi Arabia, we're not going to talk about feminism. So it's this whole set of duplicitous standards that they want to manage. And this is sort of a textbook microcosm of that process that the U.S. government is trying to impose.
I want to go to Blinken taking some questions on the tarmac earlier this week from Andrea Mitchell, and get you to respond to what seems to be a really fragile and frankly transparently false narrative that the State Department is really trying to go with around this particular question of who's responsible for the ceasefire not coming into effect. I want to get your response to this.
You say that everyone but Hamas has agreed to this. Benjamin Netanyahu has certainly said otherwise publicly, and the hostage families are saying, you should try everything if this fails. And it's quite possible it will fail, with him now toughening his position, more likely, with his right-wing partners. If this fails, they want you to work through Qatar and deal with Hamas to get the Americans home. And we are reporting at NBC News that that is being discussed as a backup plan, if no other way to get a ceasefire, doing it without Israel agreeing to a ceasefire. Can you tell us about that? And also, if the war continues, won't the Palestinian death toll be unacceptable, as the National Security Advisor in Israel has said, to the end of the year, after such a horrific death toll in getting the hostages out militarily this weekend?
First, let me be very clear. Israel has accepted the proposal. In fact, they were critical in putting it forward. So the only party, no, that is what the official position of the Israeli government and the Prime Minister. So the only party that has not accepted, the only party that's not said yes, is Hamas. That's who everyone's waiting on. That's who the Palestinians in Gaza are waiting on. It's who the Israelis are waiting on. It's who the hostages and the hostage families are waiting on. It's who the entire region and the entire world is waiting on. And so we'll see. Does Hamas want to end this conflict, end this war that it started, or not? We'll find out. But it's clear that virtually the entire world has come together in support of the proposal. And the only open question is, will Hamas say yes?
Now, Sam, I saw you throw your hands up in the air when he said this is the official position of the Israeli government. And Andrea Mitchell, who is some of these reporters we get tarred with the idea that we are biased and in the tank for Hamas. Andrea Mitchell is not one of the people who gets that stereotype. Even she objected at the same time in the clip that I saw you throw your hands in the air. So why the strong response?
Because he's just making stuff up. He's just saying, and they put in the UN Security Council resolution that Israel accepted this thing. There's virtually no evidence that Israel has genuinely accepted this thing. I think I saw one statement that was really weirdly phrased and backhanded by one Israeli official, saying that they'll go along with this process or something. But there have been repeated statements by Netanyahu. There have been headlines in mainstream U.S. outlets saying Netanyahu's, he doesn't want this. He wants to continue. So I think that this is part of the dynamic, that they don't want a meaningful discussion on these things because even mainstream people don't want to go along with this. And I mean, she also asked about U.S. citizens who are being held. So I mean, and saying, why don't you negotiate directly? I mean, so what's happening here is that the U.S. government is subjecting its own citizens to Israel's Hannibal directive. They are in effect saying we're stalling a genuine negotiating process that has killed U.S. citizens, knowing full well that it is Israeli policy to kill captives in order to weaken Hamas's hand in all of this. I don't know what legal red lines there are there, but I bet that there are some that U.S. citizens are directly dying as a result of this U.S. policy.
Can you speak to what's motivating Netanyahu right now? Because the way this has been framed up is that Netanyahu is basically between a rock and a hard place as someone whose political future and ability to avoid the legal trouble that he's facing in Israel that could very well put him in jail is dependent on him staying in office and basically continuing this war, because until the war is ended, whatever that means, however he wants to define it, he basically has isn't suspend elections, is not going to be forced out of office. And it seems that shortly after this kind of ceasefire announcement, Benny Gantz resigned from Netanyahu's war cabinet, seemingly in frustration over Benjamin Netanyahu's posture. Can you help us understand what's going on sort of domestically in Israel that might be motivating Netanyahu's stubbornness on this issue?
I don't know that it's necessarily just simply he's out to save his political neck and that he has to cater to his right wing. This is a longstanding goal of Israel. These genocidal statements that we've seen from Israel don't come out of nothing. This is endemic to the, mainstream Zionist philosophy of taking the land and driving out and killing Palestinians to do it, which we've seen play out over the decades. This is an extreme form of it, but they found a very useful pretext by Hamas's attack. Netanyahu has a long history. I mean, back in, when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened, he was quoted in the Hebrew press as saying, he was out of government at that point, or not as prime minister. And he was like, we should have taken that opportunity when the world was distracted to do a mass expulsion of the Palestinians. He's been chomping at the bit to accelerate Israel's expansionism. So I think that there are real underlying currents, both in the U.S. and Israel, that are driving this policy, that are driving the fact that Biden, while he postures as not wanting Israel to go into Rafah, pretends that it isn't going into Rafah, in effect facilitating it's going into Rafah. It's a pretext. Biden is pretending to be pro-peace while facilitating this. So there is a deep structure in both the U.S. and Israel that is guiding this. And I think that accounts for why we've seen this slaughter go on for 8 months.
But just to be clear, isn't the argument that Benny Gantz, for instance, is part of the far-right coalition that Netanyahu needs to retain control, and that is the part of the coalition that is pushing, in particular, as you described, for this increasing settlements in both the West Bank and kind of resettling Gaza. We covered the right-wing settler conference back in January, where you had people dancing along with, I think, 14 cabinet members at the time, renaming cities in Gaza on the map from Palestinian names to Israeli names. That is the kind of ethos of a whole section of government that is frankly just going to not tolerate any kind of ceasefire or kind of perspective into this without bigger land claims, at least, or at least bigger land grabs, at least. When on the other side, you have the United States that is ostensibly able, even if Joe Biden is refusing to do so, to withhold military aid in a way that really would imperil Israel in a really real way. Do you think that those dynamics are not at all at play on Netanyahu? This isn't about trying to rehabilitate Netanyahu's reputation, obviously, or to say that he has any interest in exercising restraint at all with respect to Gaza, but that he's facing a real political consideration that is perhaps explaining why he would risk severing a relationship with the United States of America that Israel basically fundamentally depends on for its own survival.
I don't think he's posing that risk. I think Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Avril Haines are determined to see this process through. I don't think that Netanyahu is taking a risk here. I have not seen any real non-posture, statement or policy coming from the United States that it is serious about wanting Israel to stop. It poses in certain ways that it wants to wash its hands of the situation because of Biden's electoral prospects, perhaps, but to manipulate public opinion, global opinion. But I don't really see any evidence that Biden is trying to stop this. So that leads me to conclude that they're fundamentally on board, and barring that, Netanyahu certainly isn't going to stop it, regardless of what coalition he has or doesn't have domestically.
One way to maybe get into this is to talk about what is actually on the table with respect to the ceasefire, because one kind of slippage that I've been noting, and that others who are really good at kind of following the narrative building that's been going on, like Adam Johnson over at Citations Needed, have pointed out that the word ceasefire gets used to mean very different things. And the whole point from the perspective of the Palestinian side is to have something that is enduring, a withdrawal of troops, permanent, yes, to have a guarantee that they're basically not going to give over hostages, which are taking of hostages is a war crime, but real politics-wise is the only real leverage that exists in the situation. Although, given this Hannibal directive news, unclear how much leverage that really even presents, but never mind. But that is the only kind of, at least political leverage that exists to get the siege to stop, to prevent the most radical and excessive dreams of Israel's far-right government from taking place in terms of a reoccupation of Gaza, right? And on the other side, you've seen both the United States and Israel talking about agreeing to versions of things that are 6-week pauses and the like. And at the same time that you hear Netanyahu saying things like a ceasefire is a non-starter, I want to eliminate Hamas, I won't stop until Hamas is eliminated, which all point to not agreeing to anything that looks like a ceasefire as we understand it and as Palestinians understand it. I mean, what is actually in these agreements? And maybe you can get into a little bit the news that's come out today, that, again, Blinken keeps, and State Department officials keep reiterating that the only person left to come to the table is Hamas. Hamas has said it has responded with some basically edits, but that it's open to the negotiation, is definitely at the bargaining table. What is going on there?
Yeah, I mean, Hamas is saying we agree to this, but we want to make sure that it's real and that it is a permanent ceasefire at the end of this process. We don't want to enter into a process, fork over the captives that we have, and then they like even escalate their slaughter, and that's a very legitimate concern. I wrote a piece a while back at the beginning of this, actually, about thinking that this is how the dynamics would go by Iraq. Sorry, I feel like I'm an old guy who's like, let me tell you an old story.
No, it's helpful perspective.
When Iraq invaded Kuwait, there were a bunch of Westerners there, and the Iraqi government took them captive. And a bunch of people went to Iraq, European parliamentarians, Jesse Jackson, and they coaxed Saddam Hussein into giving up the captives that he had. And then a couple of weeks later, the U.S. bombed the crap out of Iraq. So what follows from that? I'm not for taking captives, but in realpolitik terms, that was the only thing stopping the United States from bombing the crap out of Iraq. And once they handed them over, they effectively signed their own death warrant. So I don't know that Hamas is, directly aware of that parallel, but I'm sure the dynamics are fairly familiar to them. So Hamas is saying, we agree to this generally, but we want real guarantees that this ceasefire is going to be permanent. And, the asymmetries of power are so tremendous. I mean, part of the agreement is that they hand over their captives and that Israel hand over some captives. But, Israel can re-arrest those people in a heartbeat. So even the concessions by Israel are, may well be fleeting, whereas the concessions by Hamas are permanent. So there's an incredible asymmetry of power, and they're saying we need actual guarantees.
Yeah, I just looked it up real quick. Al Jazeera reported that as of January 10th, so months ago, 6,000 Palestinians had been arrested in the West Bank since October 7th. And that was, again, months ago, already 6,000. So you're right. There is this asymmetry where you can say there's a hostage release, you can let Palestinians back out into the West Bank, but that's the nature of occupation, that Israel has every ability to go and scoop people back up at a moment's notice. I want to get your reaction to how this is playing out in the mainstream media. There was a pretty interesting exchange with Jake Tapper and Israeli journalist Barak Ravid earlier today. Let's take a listen.
News this in our world lead. Hamas has responded to the latest proposal for a hostage and ceasefire deal, and Hamas has rejected it. CNN political and foreign policy analyst Barak Ravid is breaking this. Did Hamas, Barak, give any explanation for its rejection?
Hi, Jake. So first, Hamas did not say that it rejected the deal. Hamas said that it gave a response to the Qatari and Egyptian mediators, that it gave several comments and remarks on parts of the Israeli proposal. Israel, the Israeli government, Israeli officials are the ones saying that after they received Hamas's response and analyzed it, they treat it as a rejection. I think we still need to hear from the mediators and most importantly, from the White House. That White House spokesman John Kirby said that the White House is still analyzing and studying the Hamas response. So Hamas is saying it just gave a few comments. Israel is saying Hamas rejected the deal. The White House still hasn't said anything of substance. I think we should wait and hear more what the White House says, what the Qataris say, and what the Egyptians say.
So U.S. officials say that they believe Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar feels as though he has the upper hand in the negotiations. This after a Wall Street Journal report that says that messages that they've seen from Sinwar show that he believes Hamas is benefiting from the civilian death toll of Palestinians in Gaza. Is that similar to what you're hearing from officials in Israel and the United States and elsewhere?
So the Israelis said for a long time that, Sinwar, that there's a big gap between Sinwar and Hamas leadership, Hamas's political leadership in Qatar.
All right, Sam, it did seem kind of remarkable to me that Barak Ravid, who has gotten some flack from fellow journalists for being too much of a stenographer for the Biden administration, even he is forced to sort of, or maybe voluntarily as happily, I don't mean to impute, values to him, but it pushes back against Jake Tapper's characterization there that it's Hamas who's rejected the deal.
It's really funny that Tapper is, more extreme than him, who has been an incredible constant outlet for information and disinformation from the Biden administration, and who himself is Israeli and obviously very pro-Israeli. So yeah, that's a very interesting exchange, and a very telling one that Tapper goes maximalist, saying Hamas rejection, and he sort of gives a little bit of nuance, but ultimately he's putting the noose around their neck, I think, but at least some level of nuance. I noticed at the end of it they were putting it at Sinwar, and I saw that was part of the line was after Hamas responded favorably, part of the moving goalpost process was we want to hear it from Sinwar. So they're trying to in effect defang Sinwar as this brave fighter, so that he is agreeing and is forced to verbalize his agreement to this ceasefire before Netanyahu does, if Netanyahu ever will, in effect attempting to undermine the capacity or the morale of the Palestinians to be fighting.
Yeah, I was going to say that seems pretty inconsistent with Netanyahu, who on the other side of things is going around saying basically this is a non-starter, while Blinken insists, well, the official, you heard him throw that needle in the earlier clip. The official position of the Israeli government is that they accept they're open to this ceasefire. They accept this ceasefire. He didn't say Benjamin Netanyahu accepted the ceasefire, perhaps because the obvious contradiction between the words that have been coming out of Netanyahu's mouth and the idea that he's gung-ho for this is too much for even him to bear.
Right. Yeah, and they don't want to. Yeah, and they don't want to deal, or they don't want to highlight, Hamas's political division. Hania has said he accepts a two-state solution. Hania has said we of course years ago renounced the old Hamas charter, and we draw a distinction between Zionism and Jews and so on and so forth. All of that is completely obscured. It's just I don't think I'm not a supporter of Hamas or anything, but I mean I don't know if there's ever been a group that's been talked about so much but heard from so little in terms of what their positions are, which is a long-standing problem. I mean, you had Jimmy Carter and Mary Robinson years ago talking to Hamas and advocating that others talk to Hamas. My old Congresswoman Donna Edwards went and talked to Hamas, and then she got out. She got kicked out of there. So that really is an extraordinary third rail of U.S. politics that I think is driving this complete lack of dialogue.
Speaking of Donna Edwards, did you happen to see that Code Pink approached her in the halls of Congress asking her if she would consider boycotting, I think it was Donna Edwards, boycotting.
No. That was Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Oh, you're right. It was Eleanor Holmes Norton. My bad. We'll cut that out. I want to ask you about this idea that the U.S. could go around Israel and negotiate directly with Qatar to get hostages released. How realistic is that plan?
I'm not sure.
How does that work?
I mean, the U.S. could say to Qatar, you tell Hamas to release the Americans, and we will, whatever. We will, give Israel a deadline in order to cut off weapons to Israel. They could make any number of offers to secure the release of the U.S. captives. I haven't. This isn't something that I've thought through, but I'm sure that there can be something that can be done. And it's just amazing how little discussion there has been about the U.S. captives and about how the U.S. Has not attempted to do anything to facilitate their release. Your mind goes to the Iranian hostage crisis, which there's a lot of stories associated with that, of course, and how that went down. I don't know if you want more old stories, but yeah.
Please,
Yeah.
please.
Well, I mean, I wrote a James Aberesk, who was a senator, Arab American senator, probably the most radical senator since World War II in the United States. He, during the Iranian hostage crisis, tried to broker a deal. This was after he was a senator. He was a private lawyer, and he worked out a deal with the Iranians to say, this collapsed Jimmy Carter's presidency, that Iran had taken you Americans hostage at the U.S. embassy. They found all kinds of horrible things going on, documents about how the U.S. was, double dealing in Iran. And, they found a printing press where the U.S. was printing Iranian currency in order to sabotage the economy, all kinds of things. And Iran, he agreed with the moderates in Iraq, because he had the extremists in Iran then and the moderates, Beni Sadr. He went over there and met with Beni Sadr, the moderate, and they worked out a deal. By Beni Sadr would try to get the extremists to release the U.S. hostages, and in return, what Aberesk said he could try to do was to get the U.S. Senate to hold comprehensive hearings about all of the grievances that Iran had. That's all they wanted. They just wanted an airing, because this was after the church committees and other real serious hearings that the Senate used to do about U.S. wrongdoing, and that could have solved everything. The hostages could have been released. Jimmy Carter's presidency could have been preserved. You wouldn't have had Ronald Reagan, all kinds of stuff. Carter wouldn't agree to it. And they worked out a whole process whereby the hearings would be announced, and then the hostages would be released, and then the hearings would take place, and Iranian grievances could be heard. Instead, what you got was double dealing between the extremists, the Casey and around Reagan, and the extremists in Iran, and they did the arms for hostages deal. And all of that. So they ended up dealing, and the hostages were released the day that Reagan was inaugurated in 1981. So that's what happens from a lack of dialogue. You end up with these demented, behind-the-scenes double dealings that only help the most violent-prone factions in either camp, instead of a peaceful, open-ended process.
Yeah, I really am struck by how hostages have been sort of weaponized throughout this conflict, but also in particular, how the narrative does seem to be crumbling, like so many of these narratives, as hostage families become more vocal about how they feel like their family members have not been prioritized. I want to play you a clip from an interview with a hostage family member on Mehdi Hassan's new program, Zeteo, and get your reaction to this.
Always he and the government always choose the wrong way, and always, ever since October 8th. Okay? Everything they do is directed at not getting the hostages back. This is the plain truth. They had many opportunities to sign a deal. They're always sabotaging their own initiatives. When people from the professional, the negotiating team itself are crying out loud, this thing can't go on. We're sabotaging our own moves. And this is the reality for the past 9 months. Okay? This is why we didn't get any hostages back alive during this period after the initial a hostage exchange deal that was also got, exploded because on the last day, instead of keeping it, going on and releasing some more and getting, remediating the situation further. I'm really appalled by the way the government is dealing with this kind of hot situation. This is why we're so, we're thrilled to see the American initiative, because this gives us hope. The way the Israeli government is conducting gives us little hope, little to no hope. As I said, 7 hostages in 8 months during a military operation. And by the way, as you mentioned, Netanyahu was the first to jump on the photo app and push himself inside the frame with his, as he said, called it heroic military operation. The other that came back during the hostage deal didn't get a visit. It's not such a good photo op, apparently, for his base to see people coming alive and well in a deal.
Yes.
It is good to see heroic actions and to
Yes.
So not all hostages are treated equally upon release. What that the nephew of a hostage victim is saying, a hostage is saying, is that Netanyahu only wants to exploit those hostages that are recovered through military means and not those that are recovered through diplomacy. Moreover, it is not lost on me that obviously the pretext for my firing seems to have been an interview that I did with a family of a hostage member. And I specifically put to her the question of how she feels about Netanyahu not prioritizing the safety lives release of hostage victims, a question that she basically sidestepped and seemed unwilling to answer. Can I ask you what you've heard from the Israeli government with respect to hostage negotiations? We've covered protests from hostage families who feel like Netanyahu isn't prioritizing the return of people's family members, especially given that your sister was injured. The need to get her back home quickly and get medical attention seems to be quite obvious. The former spokesperson for hostage families gave an interview about a month ago, Chaim Rubenstein, saying that there is no doubt that Netanyahu is preventing a deal to release the abductees, and said also, in retrospect, we learned that Hamas offered to immediately release all the abducted citizens if the IDF does not enter the Strip, but the government rejected that proposal. What do you make of how Netanyahu has been prioritizing the return of your sister and the other hostages?
Because I'm not in the negotiation team, and neither Chaim Rubenstein, none of us knows what's really going on. All I can say is that none of us are doing enough to release them because they're not here. Not me, not my government, and neither the international community.
All of this in the context of reporting that the hostages that were recovered didn't have any accusations of having been sexually abused. When they said that they were not sexually abused, there were articles written up in the Israeli press saying they must have Munchausen syndrome or somehow be psychologically unable to remember their abuse. There was a story that one of the hostages was made to do dishes, and this was characterized as a form of torture at the same time that Palestinians are being actually tortured in this desert camp, where it was reported in the past week that Palestinian men are having metal rods put up into their rectums. One prisoner died from these electric metal rod treatments. And the news that one of the hostages even had a cake made for her birthday. Again, of course, it doesn't excuse the fact of the hostage taking or the experience, obviously the trauma of having been a hostage, but it does seem like there's some really bad PR coming out for Israel, specifically with respect to hostages, that is frankly probably motivating Netanyahu to not want to get that involved with those hostages that are released through means other than attacking, sieging Gaza.
Yeah, I think that all of that is totally legitimate in terms of questioning the narrative on October 7th, but and up until this weekend, part of what the narrative this weekend was diabolical in that it put the two things together of rescuing hostages and slaughtering Palestinians, as if that's the only way to do it, and to highlight that front and center, just as the U.S. is pushing for a ceasefire. As if to say, we're not wanting a ceasefire because we're being successful in terms of getting hostages out. I think that's how Israel is attempting to portray this. It's a completely false narrative. And it's fascinating to hear from Israelis themselves realizing that it's clear to them, even increasingly, that it's not an Israeli goal to get the hostages out, that they're preferencing, as you say, the hostages who are gotten through violence rather than through diplomacy, because they don't want to highlight the diplomacy, because they don't want the diplomacy, because they want to keep attacking Palestinian society, and they want to attack any journalist like yourself that attempts to question the narrative in terms of the sheer total and complete evil of Hamas, and that they cannot possibly be negotiated with. One of the, I pushed hard for a country to invoke the Genocide Convention, and I thought South Africa did great. But one aspect that they didn't really get into was the propaganda aspect and how that dovetails with the genocidal intent. They highlighted, all of the statements about Amalek and no food and no electricity and so on. But the whole narrative that they put out early on about the mass rapes and the systematic rapes and the beheaded babies and all of that. Why did they do that?
Yeah.
They did that to buy themselves enough time because they knew that they were going to slaughter a bunch of Palestinians and that they were going to slaughter a bunch of Palestinian babies. And they wanted the world, and especially the US public, to be impervious to that, to not feel that, and to have in their mind that, oh, Hamas is unspeakable evil. So any images that I might see of bad things resulting from Israel's actions, we have to excuse them because they are battling unprecedented evil. That is why those stories were put out there. That is part of the genocidal intent.
I think that's such an important point. It's worth noting that earlier today, we got the results of a UN investigation. Remember the Pramila Patten report, the previous UN report, she did not have an investigatory mandate. Now we do have a report with the investigatory mandate, which showed a lot of things, including that the UN has not been able to independently verify Israel's allegations of October 7th sexual violence, quote, due to a lack of access to victims, witnesses, and crime sites, and the obstruction of its investigations by Israeli authorities. Meanwhile, it found specific allegations to be false, inaccurate, or contradictory with other evidence or statements, including these reports by the ultra-religious Zaka group, which, again, to your point, were raised by the hostage family member that I was interviewing on the Hill that many people think precipitated my firing. These things really do seem to come in hand, this idea of believe women, that there is this specter of rape hanging over the Israeli hostages in particular, even as the exact same report in investigation, this UN investigation, showed ample evidence from direct witness testimony, something that has yet to emerge on the other side of this, of routine and systemic sexual violence against Palestinian prisoners. Particularly, I want to just read this quote. Crimes of humanity, of extermination, gender persecution targeting Palestinian men and boys, murder, forcible transfer, and torture, and inhuman, cruel treatment. That's from this newly released UN report. Sam, as we wrap, I just want to ask you, you do seem to be expressing a sort of, pessimism, skepticism that any of these things that are coming out now and have been coming out on a rolling basis over the course of months are really going to have any effect on the Biden administration. It does seem to me that its efforts to at least appear to be pushing back against Netanyahu are ratcheting up. That is not substantive. I don't mean to pretend that it is. But of course, we had the press conference, I guess it was last Friday or last Thursday, I can't remember now, where he came out and said that he supported a ceasefire. And that's when we kind of started this whole Netanyahu's on board with the ceasefire shtick that we've been playing with now for over a week. It does seem like there's a consciousness about how bad this is for Biden politically. He is in an election year, obviously. I think this is coming alongside horrible looking clips of him not seeming to be able to keep it together and look cogent during the Juneteenth celebrations at the White House. We have the debates coming up. I think there's a lot of concern about how he is going to fare there. And having this kind of Palestinian problem in the back of his head, that's obviously a reductive way to describe what has been described as a plausible genocide by the ICJ, does seem to at least be provoking a narrative shift. I mean, you're having Barak Ravid pushing back against Jake Tapper. You're having Andrea Mitchell pushing back against Blinken. I mean, do you see this going somewhere? Do you see Biden ultimately having to confront a personal red line that is, I have to change something here or I am fully going to lose this election and no number of yes men around me can delude me otherwise?
Yeah, I'm not optimistic that there's going to be a meaningful shift from the Biden administration. Biden is largely a figurehead. It's Blinken and Tapper and Haynes who are basically running the show, and they're underlings. I think that what needs to happen is there has to be mass movement continuing in the United States and globally. I mentioned earlier processes that could happen at the General Assembly. That's happened before. In 1956, it was a brazen colonial strategy by Israel, France, and Great Britain. They invaded Egypt and took Gaza, and they were forced out using that General Assembly process, uniting for peace. The U.S. and the USSR teamed up against France and Great Britain at the time to overcome their veto. Things like that can happen at the global stage now. And domestically, I think that there needs to be, as you alluded to in your comments, people are going to get into this mindset of we got to cut Biden some slack because Trump is going to be worse. And this is the trap that people have been in for my entire adult lifetime in the United States. The Republican, and sometimes it's Trump, and sometimes it's whoever, some other Republican. You got to suck it up and get behind the Democrat, or because the Republican's going to be worse. And there are people on the other side who think the exact opposite way, and you in effect have voters turned into serfs. And we talked about it briefly last time I was on your show, my Vote Pact thing, which sort of advocates the emergence of a radical center, an anti-establishment populist center, where you have authentic people from the left and the right converging together to overcome that dynamic. Because otherwise, you end up, maybe Biden is aiming to have a ceasefire just long enough after the election, and then greenlight Netanyahu really beating the crap out of the Palestinians. You don't know what you're getting, or what the history of what we're getting is a horrible one. Biden has a terrible, terrible record on foreign policy. So I think that there's every reason to be skeptical of where Biden and Trump are going to land on this issue and so many others.
Sam Husseini, I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through this really bizarre narrative dance that we're seeing across the Biden administration and his acolytes in the media. This has been really elucidating. Can you let the audience know where they can find more of you in your work?
Thank you very much. I write regularly at Husseini.substack.com. That's HUSSEINI. .substack.com, and I try to get regular pieces out there.
All right. Thank you. And thank you to all the audience for listening today. Thank you to all of the new members who have come following my departure from the Hill. Just so you know, you can get an additional episode of Bad Faith every week by subscribing at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Those drop on Mondays in addition to these free Thursday episodes. I have been getting a lot of interest from people reaching out, wanting to come on, particularly because they think of the high profile nature of my firings. We've got some really great guests lined up for the coming weeks. So I think you'll feel really good about joining the Bad Faith family. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.